The emergency room doors burst open, and Dr. Vivian Cross didn't even look up from her clipboard. "Sir, I told you already, without insurance verification, we can't move him to the front of the queue," she said, her voice flat, bored, like she was reciting a line she'd said 1,000 times. The man standing in front of her was holding a limp 7-year-old boy in his arms. The boy's face was pale, his lips slightly blue, his breathing shallow and fast. The man's shirt was wrinkled, his shoes were scuffed, and there was a coffee stain on his sleeve that he hadn't noticed until just now. He looked like exactly what he was pretending to be, a tired, broke, single father at the end of his rope. "Please," he said quietly. "He has a heart condition. This isn't a normal fever. I need someone to see him now." Dr. Cross finally glanced up, her eyes sweeping over him with the kind of practiced dismissal reserved for people she'd already decided didn't matter. "Everyone here thinks their case is the emergency, sir. Take a seat. Someone will call you when it's your turn." Behind her, a security guard shifted uncomfortably, watching the exchange. A young nurse froze mid-step, clutching a folder to her chest, saying nothing. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked down at his son, brushed the hair from his sweaty forehead, and carried him to the waiting room chairs, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with something far colder than anger. "What Dr. Vivian Cross didn't know, what nobody in that emergency room knew, was that the man she'd just turned away built the very hospital she worked in. His name was on a plaque in the lobby that most staff walked past every day without reading. In less than 20 minutes, her decision would collide with a truth she never saw coming. But to understand how it got to this moment, we have to go back 3 weeks. Daniel Hale was not a man who liked attention. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck with a dent in the rear bumper he'd never bothered to fix. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and if you passed him in the grocery store, you'd think he was just another tired dad trying to get through the week. He rarely spoke about his past, and when people asked what he did for a living, he usually just said, "I'm in medicine, sort of. Consulting." That answer wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. Daniel had spent almost 20 years building Mercy Grand Regional Hospital from nothing. He'd started as a young cardiothoracic surgeon who watched too many patients in his hometown die because the nearest proper cardiac unit was 90 minutes away. He made a promise to himself that he'd fix that. He poured his savings, then his loans, then years of his life into building a hospital that treated people with dignity regardless of what they could pay. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations 5 years ago, after his wife passed away from ovarian cancer, choosing instead to raise his son, Eli, quietly, away from boardrooms and press releases. He still owned the hospital. He still sat on the board, technically. But he showed up so rarely that most of the newer staff had no idea what he looked like. To them, Daniel Hale was just a name etched into a bronze plaque near the donor wall, next to a stiff, professionally lit photo from over a decade ago. Nobody connected that photo to the tired man who occasionally showed up in worn jeans, asking quiet questions nobody thought to answer honestly. Eli was Daniel's whole world. 7 years old, sharp as a tack, with his mother's laugh and his father's quiet stubbornness. Eli had been born with a congenital heart defect, a narrowing of the aorta that had already required 2 surgeries in his short life. He was stable most days, full of energy, riding his bike around the cul-de-sac and driving his father slightly insane with an obsession with dinosaurs. But Daniel knew, better than almost anyone alive, how quickly stable could turn into critical. Cardiac issues in kids didn't wait for convenient timing. They came like storms, fast, and sometimes without warning. That was the stake Daniel carried every single day. Not company profits. Not stock prices. Just one small boy's fragile heart, and the terror that lived quietly under every peaceful afternoon. 3 weeks before that emergency room confrontation, Daniel decided to do something he did periodically, something almost nobody at Mercy Grand knew about. He went undercover in his own hospital. It wasn't dramatic, not the way people imagine. He didn't wear a fake mustache or a disguise. He simply showed up as himself, Daniel Hale, single dad, and let the staff assume whatever they wanted based on his clothes, his tired eyes, and the fact that he always paid with a worn debit card instead of flashing anything expensive. He wanted to know, truly know, how patients without connections or money were treated. Not the sanitized version presented in board meetings. The real version. He brought Eli in for a routine cardiology follow-up, checking in under a slightly simplified version of his own legal name that the system already had on file from years back, before most current staff were hired. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked twice. That's how he first crossed paths with Dr. Vivian Cross. Vivian Cross was, by every external measure, an accomplished physician. She'd graduated near the top of her class, completed her residency at a prestigious program, and had climbed quickly into a senior attending position in Mercy Grand's emergency and outpatient cardiology unit. She was sharp, efficient, and undeniably skilled with a scalpel and a diagnosis. But somewhere along the way, competence had curdled into something uglier. She'd developed a quiet, corrosive belief that her time was more valuable than most of the people she treated. She wasn't cartoonishly cruel. She didn't scream or insult people outright. Her cruelty was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. It showed up in the way she rushed through appointments with patients who looked like they couldn't afford a specialist consult. It showed up in the way she let her eyes linger a half-second longer on a nice watch or a designer bag before deciding how much effort someone deserved. It showed up in the sighs she didn't bother hiding, and the clipped, condescending tone she reserved for people she'd already mentally filed under "not worth my full attention." Daniel noticed all of it on that first visit. He sat in her office with Eli, describing a slight increase in fatigue his son had been experiencing, watching Dr. Cross type notes into her laptop without ever really looking at either of them. "Kids get tired," she said, barely glancing over. "He's probably just growing. I wouldn't worry unless something dramatic happens." His cardiologist recommended monitoring any changes closely, given his history, Daniel said carefully. Dr. Cross exhaled through her nose, the kind of sound that said she'd heard this 1,000 times from anxious parents. "I understand you're concerned, Mr. Hale, but I have a full schedule today. If something changes, bring him to the ER. Otherwise, let's not turn every little symptom into a crisis, all right?" She said all right the way people say things that aren't really questions. Daniel said nothing. He simply nodded, thanked her, and left with Eli's small hand in his. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just carelessness. This was a doctor who had stopped seeing patients as people and started seeing them as inconveniences to be processed. He decided to keep watching. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel made a handful of quiet visits to different departments in his own hospital, sometimes bringing Eli for check-ins, sometimes simply sitting in waiting areas observing, the way any tired parent might while waiting for test results. Nobody paid him much attention. That was exactly the point. He watched Dr. Cross dismiss an elderly man's complaints about chest tightness because his EKG looked fine last month, only for a different doctor to catch early signs of an arrhythmia the following week. He watched her cut off a nervous mother mid-sentence because "we're running behind schedule today." Small things. Nothing that would show up in a formal complaint. But patterns, adding up, quietly. Then came the moment that truly settled things for Daniel, the gut punch moment involving someone else entirely. Her name was Marisol Reyes. She worked as a custodian in Mercy Grand's East Wing, mopping floors and emptying bins on the night shift for nearly 9 years. She was kind in the exhausted, unglamorous way that nobody ever really thanked her for, the kind of kindness that shows up in small gestures, like remembering which patients liked extra pillows, or slipping a worried father a granola bar from her own bag because the vending machine was broken. Marisol's teenage son had been struggling with unexplained stomach pain for weeks. She'd finally scraped together enough courage, and enough of her meager savings, to bring him in for an evaluation, hoping her employee status might at least earn her a little consideration. Daniel happened to be in the same waiting area, Eli coloring quietly beside him, when he overheard Dr. Cross speaking to Marisol near the front desk. "I already told you, we can't just squeeze someone in because you work here," Dr. Cross said, not unkindly exactly, but with an unmistakable edge of impatience. "There's a proper referral process. You know that." "I know, Dr. Cross, he's been in pain for 3 weeks now, and I didn't know who else to ask," Marisol said, her voice small, apologetic, the way people get when they've been trained by life to expect no. Then take him to urgent care like everyone else, Dr. Cross replied, already turning to walk away. I have patients waiting. Marisol stood there for a moment, her son's hand in hers, blinking fast like she was trying not to cry in front of him. Then she quietly led him back out toward the parking lot, her shoulders slightly hunched, the posture of someone used to swallowing disappointment without complaint. Daniel watched the entire thing, his jaw tightening. He knew Marisol, though she had no idea who he really was. He remembered her from years back, when he used to walk the halls more often, back when his wife was still alive and would bring him lunch on his long shifts. Marisol had always been unfailingly kind, the kind of quiet backbone that kept a hospital spirit intact even when nobody in leadership noticed her. That night, he barely slept. Not because of policy violations or PR concerns, but because he understood, more clearly than ever, what his hospital had slowly become for people who didn't have the right clothes, the right insurance, or the right last name. The small clues about who Daniel really was had been there the whole time, hidden in plain sight. The way certain older nurses would occasionally do a double take when they passed him, like they almost recognized him but couldn't quite place it. The way he sometimes referenced hospital history with a strange, specific familiarity, mentioning the old East Wing before its renovation, or the original naming of the cardiac unit, details a random visitor wouldn't casually know. Once, an older security guard named Walt had greeted him with a hesitant Mr. Hale, before Daniel quickly deflected, saying he got that a lot, that he had one of those common faces. Nobody put it together. Not yet. 3 days before that emergency room confrontation, Eli had a mild episode at home, nothing catastrophic, but enough to worry Daniel deeply. A brief moment of dizziness, a slightly irregular heartbeat that lasted only seconds but left Daniel's hands shaking as he checked his son's pulse. He called Eli's regular cardiologist, who advised bringing him in for reassessment if anything changed further, just to be safe. 2 days later, in the middle of the night, Eli woke up struggling to breathe. It wasn't a full crisis, not yet, but it was serious enough that Daniel didn't hesitate. He carried his son to the truck in his pajamas, drove straight to Mercy Grand's emergency entrance, and burst through the doors with Eli limp and pale in his arms, exactly as he had feared he might one day have to. The night desk was chaotic. A car accident earlier that evening had filled several beds, and the waiting room was crowded with people in various states of distress. Daniel approached the front desk, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. My son has a congenital heart condition. He's having trouble breathing and his heart rate is irregular. I need him seen immediately. The intake nurse, overwhelmed and understaffed, flagged down the nearest available physician, which happened to be Dr. Vivian Cross, pulled from a nearby exam room mid-shift change, tired and irritable after a long day. She glanced at Eli, then at Daniel, her eyes doing that familiar sweep, worn shoes, wrinkled shirt, coffee-stained sleeve, a beat-up truck barely visible through the glass doors outside. Sir, I told you already, without insurance verification, we can't move him to the front of the queue, she said, not recognizing that this was, in fact, the same Mr. Hale she'd brushed off weeks earlier, filed away in her memory as just another anxious, low-priority parent. Please, Daniel said. He has a heart condition. This isn't a normal fever. I need someone to see him now. Everyone here thinks their case is the emergency, sir, she replied. Take a seat. Someone will call you when it's your turn. Daniel carried Eli to the waiting room chairs, his heart pounding, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios he understood better than almost any parent could, precisely because of his medical background. He knew the statistics. He knew how fast things could deteriorate. He also knew, with a cold, rising certainty, that this ended tonight not just for Eli's sake, but for every Marisol, every dismissed elderly patient, every family Vivian Cross had decided wasn't worth her full attention. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call 911. He didn't need to, not for what he was about to do. Instead, he called Dr. Amara Osei, the hospital's chief of medicine, someone who had worked closely with Daniel since the earliest days of Mercy Grand's founding and who knew exactly who he was. Amara, he said quietly, watching Eli's chest rise and fall too fast. It's Daniel. I'm in the ER with Eli. He's having a cardiac episode and I've just been told to wait my turn. There was a brief pause on the line, then Dr. Rose's voice sharpened instantly. "I'm on my way right now." Within 4 minutes, the emergency room doors swung open again, and Dr. Amara Osei strode in with the unmistakable urgency of someone who outranked everyone currently on shift. She spotted Daniel immediately and rushed over, her expression shifting from professional concern to open alarm the moment she saw Eli's labored breathing. "Mr. Hale, I am so sorry," she said, already signaling to nearby staff. "Get a crash cart to Bay 3, now. This is Eli Hale, cardiac history, possible arrhythmic episode. Move." The entire ER seemed to freeze for half a second. Nurses who had been casually walking suddenly sprinted. Equipment was wheeled over immediately. And Dr. Vivian Cross, who had been charting nearby, looked up sharply at the name. "Wait, Hale," she said slowly, her professional instincts starting to catch up with a memory she couldn't quite place yet. As in Daniel Hale," Dr. Rose said, not unkindly, but firmly, as she helped guide Eli onto a gurney. "Founder of this hospital. The man whose name is on the wall you walk past every single day." The color drained from Dr. Cross's face in real time. For a moment, she said nothing at all. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him this time, and something clicked into place. The strange familiarity she'd never quite placed. The quiet way he carried himself, like someone used to being underestimated on purpose. It all rearranged itself into a completely different picture than the one she'd assumed weeks ago in her office. She started, her voice unsteady. "I didn't realize." "I'm so sorry, I didn't know who." "That's exactly the problem," Daniel said quietly, not raising his voice, not needing to. His eyes were fixed on his son as the medical team began stabilizing him. "You didn't know. So you decided he and I weren't worth your time. What if I hadn't been the hospital's founder? What if I'd just been a regular dad who couldn't afford to make noise? Would my son still be waiting in that chair right now?" Dr. Cross had no answer. There wasn't one that wouldn't incriminate her further, and she seemed to understand that fully, standing frozen in the hallway as her carefully built professional composure crumbled in real time. Dr. Osei guided the team efficiently, and within minutes, Eli was stabilized, his heart rate settling, oxygen levels improving, color slowly returning to his small face. Daniel stayed by his side, gripping his tiny hand, his own hands finally starting to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. News of what happened spread through the hospital fast, the way these things always do. By morning, most of the staff knew that the tired-looking man from the waiting room, the one nobody paid attention to, was the same Daniel Hale whose vision had built the entire institution they worked in. The following days brought a full internal review, led personally by Dr. Osei and the hospital's board of directors, of which Daniel remained a quiet, permanent member. But Daniel insisted on something the board didn't initially expect: nuance. He didn't want a public spectacle. He didn't want Vivian Cross paraded as a villain in some viral news story, even though what she'd done was serious and needed real consequences. He also understood something crucial: not everyone who witnessed the pattern of neglect was equally responsible for it. The intake nurse from that night, overwhelmed and understaffed, hadn't ignored Daniel out of malice. She'd simply been drowning under an unmanageable patient load with insufficient support, a systemic problem Daniel recognized as partly his own responsibility to fix as founder. Instead of punishing her, he ordered an immediate staffing review for night shifts and approved funding for additional emergency personnel. The young nurse who had frozen during the earlier confrontation, the one who'd clutched her folder and said nothing, was called into a private meeting with Daniel himself. She arrived nervous, expecting to be reprimanded. "I'm not here to punish you," Daniel told her gently. "I know it's hard to speak up against a senior doctor when you're new and scared of losing your job. I understand that fear better than you might think. But I want you to remember this feeling. Use it. The next time you see something that feels wrong, you don't have to be loud. You just have to say something, to someone, even quietly. That's enough to start real change." The young nurse left that meeting in tears, but not from fear this time. From relief. Dr. Vivian Cross's case was handled differently, and appropriately more seriously, because her pattern of behavior had been consistent, repeated, and knowingly dismissive over a long period of time, not a single moment of understandable human error. The board placed her on formal probation, mandated extensive retraining focused specifically on patient equity and communication, and required her to shadow social workers dealing directly with underserved patients for 3 full months, seeing firsthand the lives behind the charts she'd been so quick to dismiss. She was not fired outright. Daniel argued against it, somewhat to the board's surprise. Removing her doesn't fix the culture that let this happen for years without consequence, he said during the review meeting. If she's capable of real change, I'd rather see her become a better doctor than simply disappear and let someone else make the exact same mistakes down the line. But if this happens again, there won't be a second review. There'll just be an ending. Vivian Cross, humbled in a way she hadn't experienced in her entire career, accepted the terms without argument. In the weeks that followed, something in her did seem to shift, slowly, through the discomfort of confronting her own blind spots directly, patient by patient, story by story. Marisol Reyes received a very different kind of visit. Daniel found her one afternoon in the East Wing, still mopping floors like she had for 9 quiet, underappreciated years. He approached her carefully, not wanting to embarrass her in front of co-workers. "Marisol," he said. "Do you have a few minutes?" She looked up, startled to see the hospital's founder addressing her by name. "Mr. Hale, of course, is something wrong?" "No," he said, smiling gently. "Actually, I wanted to apologize to you personally. I was here a few weeks ago, the day you brought your son in. I saw what happened." Marisol's expression shifted, embarrassment and confusion mixing together. "Oh, that's really not necessary, sir. I understand how busy it is necessary," Daniel said firmly, but kindly. "You've worked here for 9 years, keeping this place running in ways most people never notice or thank you for. Your son deserves better than what he got that day. I'd like to personally cover his full evaluation and any necessary treatment, no referrals, no waiting. And I'd like to offer you a position in our patient services department, if you're interested. Better hours, better pay, and frankly, this hospital needs more people who actually care the way you do." Marisol's eyes filled with tears, her hand pressed briefly to her chest. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Daniel said. "Just take care of your son. That's enough." Her son's evaluation, conducted promptly the following week, revealed a treatable digestive condition that had been causing his pain, something manageable once properly diagnosed. Relief flooded through Marisol in a way she hadn't felt in months, watching her son finally start to feel like himself again. Eli recovered fully within days, his heart rhythm stabilizing under careful, immediate care that should have been his from the very first moment he walked through those doors. He spent his recovery days in a hospital bed decorated with dinosaur stickers Marisol herself brought him, visiting during her breaks, quickly becoming one of his favorite people in the building. Daniel sat by his son's bedside each evening, watching him sleep peacefully, thinking about everything that had unfolded. He thought about power, and how easily it could be hidden, and how differently people treated you depending on what they assumed about your bank account or your last name. He thought about how close Eli had come to real danger, not because of his heart condition alone, but because of a system that too often decided who deserved urgency and who didn't. He could have used his position to humiliate Dr. Cross publicly. He could have made an example of her for headlines and applause. Instead, he chose accountability with the possibility of growth, mercy without erasing consequence, and real structural changes designed to protect the next family who walked through those doors without a name anyone recognized. Weeks later, Mercy Grant quietly rolled out a new hospital-wide initiative Daniel personally championed: mandatory de-escalation and equity training for all clinical staff, an anonymous reporting system for patients who felt dismissed or mistreated, and increased night shift staffing to prevent the kind of overwhelmed conditions that had nearly cost his own son critical time. He still didn't want his name attached to any of it publicly. When Dr. Osei suggested naming the initiative after him, he simply shook his head. "This isn't about my name," he said. "It never was. It's about making sure the next tired dad who walks through those doors, wearing a stained shirt and driving a beat-up truck, gets the exact same care as anyone else. That's the whole point of why I built this place to begin with." Months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Daniel sat on a park bench watching Eli ride his bike in careful loops nearby, fully recovered, laughing at nothing in particular the way healthy 7-year-olds do. Marisol's son had joined them that day too, the two boys now fast friends after weeks of shared dinosaur stickers and hospital bed conversations. Daniel thought about how close he'd come to losing something irreplaceable, not to his son's heart condition, but to indifference, the quiet, dangerous kind that hides behind clipboards and tired sighs, deciding in an instant who's worth real attention and who isn't. He thought about Vivian Cross too, hoping, genuinely, that she'd become someone better because of what happened, not just someone punished by it. Power, Daniel had learned long ago, isn't really about what you can force people to do. It's about what you choose to do when nobody realizes you have the power to do it at all. As Eli pedaled past, waving happily, Daniel smiled and waved back, holding on to the one truth this entire ordeal had reaffirmed in him more deeply than ever before: real strength isn't announced with a name on a wall. It's proven in the quiet moments when you could demand respect, but choose to extend grace instead.